Good afternoon and good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world and when you're listening to this. Thanks for joining us for this discussion on the road not taken, why routing security matters. I'm Michael Daniel. I'm president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is a nonprofit dedicated to enabling cybersecurity companies to share threat intelligence with each other in ways that will help improve the security of the internet as a whole. And I'm really happy to have Alissa Starzak with me today, and I'll let Alissa introduce herself.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you so much for having me. I'm Alissa Starzak. I'm head of public policy at Cloudflare, which is an internet security and performance company that does a lot in the infrastructure space around this particular issue.
Great. Well, thanks for joining me today. So what we wanted to talk about was a topic that, when you first sort of say it to people, often produces, eyes glazing over, bored looks, but it's actually something that's really, really important. And that's the routing security that lies at the heart of the internet in many different ways. So maybe first off, Alissa, can you talk a little bit about sort of why this issue of routing security matters so much, and why, even if you're not a network operator, you should actually care about it?
Sure. I think what you said, the fact that nobody knows about it, is a function of the fact that people are used to turning on the computer and having the internet work, and they just don't think about what happens for that to happen. So, the reality of our interconnected internet is that communications have to go from one place to another. And again, most people who jump on the internet assume that's just going to happen. The concern with routing security is that sometimes it doesn't. And getting into the weeds of why that doesn't happen and what we can do to make sure that those problems with getting access don't happen more often is really why we're here today. Again, the reality of not being able to have your communications go where they're supposed to, not being able to access the content that you're looking for is the heart of the discussion.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, too, that part of the reason we're here is the same reason why we have a lot of other cybersecurity problems, right? That security was not built in from the beginning. And so the protocols that are often used to route traffic, particularly the Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, relies on trust, and it is simply basically it assumes, right, that the person or the other network that's telling it something is telling the truth, and that is a reasonable assumption when you were getting the internet started, but probably isn't a reasonable assumption today.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think when the internet was first getting started, there was a small group of network operators. They all knew each other, they all trusted each other, and their goal was really to make sure that things worked, that it was resilient, that communications could move quickly. They were not worried about security. And now, with the internet we have today, security is critical. And so what you're seeing is that those same protocols that we've used since the very beginning have never been updated. We haven't hardened them in the way that we really should have as the internet has grown. So with BGP, for example, what that does is it's the routing connection. It basically says the way the internet works, again, a series of interconnected networks. The idea with BGP is that it essentially announces who can take communications. And that trust means that you can essentially announce, I will take all of these communications to lead them to the right place. And if you have to rely on trust for that right now, the notion that you can announce where traffic should go, anyone in the world can announce where traffic should go, is something I think that we should be really concerned about, because it means that traffic can be misrouted really easily if you have access to one of those networks.
Yes, and a network operator can announce, I own these IP addresses. And there's no validation right now built in to ascertain whether or not they're actually allowed to say that, whether or not they actually, in fact, own those IP addresses, right? And what I think the other thing that's really interesting about some of the work that Cloudflare has done in this space and the analysis that you've done is that this often happens just by accident without malicious intent. You want to talk a little bit about how that can happen?
Sure, that happens all the time. We see routing mistakes all the time. The challenge is that sometimes you'll have a small ISP, for example, that accidentally announces an incorrect route. And if other people pick that up, so the way, again, interconnected networks work is that other people hear that announcement and say, oh, that's where I should send data. And they then start announcing that that's also where entities should send data. So it has a bit of a megaphone effect if things aren't done carefully on some of the larger providers, where all of a sudden everyone's basically putting a wrong communication out there saying, hey, this is where you send traffic, even if that's not correct. So from a practical standpoint, it could be a simple error. Somebody essentially fat-fingered something when they were working on the routing piece of it, but then everybody else picks it up and says, hey, this is where you send it, even if that's not correct. And that's the challenge that we see on the error side. It's really thinking about how we do more to prevent that communication from getting picked up, even if it's a small error, making sure that we can cabin it. And that's a lot of the work that we've been doing.
Yeah, do you have some examples that you've worked on?
Sure. So, so we have some great historical examples. We also have some personal examples for Cloudflare. For example, from the personal examples from Cloudflare, in the last couple of years, we had a big incident last year where a small ISP in Pennsylvania mistakenly announced a route. That route was then picked up by Verizon, which took all of our traffic, because that was the IP that was announced, and sent it to this small ISP in Pennsylvania, which obviously could not handle the traffic, and no one could get where they were supposed to go. That's sort of an error, a clear error. There are lots of other examples, including one from earlier this year, which are not. You always have the question of whether there are errors or whether something else is going on. So you might have a big international ISP, for example, where information then gets routed through China or through Russia, which obviously raises some pretty significant security issues. Because it's really difficult to assess whether something is a mistake or malicious, hopefully what you're really trying to do is essentially mitigate the harm when it's discovered. But that is a long-term challenge, and one of the reasons that this is such a big security issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, obviously there are errors, but as you just mentioned, there are malicious actors that can make use of the routing insecurities. How could an adversary actually make use of some of these weaknesses in the security of like BGP, for example?
So a couple different things. One, if you have the ability to redirect traffic, it enables you to potentially do surveillance. So, for example, or just to steal data. So if one of the things that we saw, an example from a couple of years ago, was actually a redirection, an intentional redirection of BGP traffic to a phishing site, which then enabled people to steal information for cryptocurrency purposes. So essentially, they were attempting to steal cryptocurrency. They redirected traffic to the wrong site. People thought they were on the right place, and then gave up a bunch of information that enabled the theft of cryptocurrency. That's on the sort of criminal version of that side. The notion that you can send traffic through a particular place, again, makes it potentially more available for surveillance purposes, which is obviously from an intelligence standpoint, something that we need to watch out for. There's also an ability to just prevent traffic from getting through. So if you really wanted to disrupt communications, for example, you decide you don't like XYZ, either country or company or any number of different things, you can actually reroute traffic to a place where it just won't get through and the internet then goes down. So a variety of different potential security threats that you see from that are potentially accessible through BGP.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about this, right, is that so then we've got an array of potential problems, right? Some of which is just human error, right? There's some mistakes. There's malicious criminal activity where it's used to, as you were saying, steal. It could be used for nation state purposes to either collect intelligence or as a disruptive activity. There's also another one, which is that you use the disruption to cover for while you do something else, right? In cyberspace, you create a distraction over here, and then you're actually conducting an operation in another place, because oftentimes these disruptions are very noisy, right? Because a lot of people notice when they can't get to, Amazon or Google or something, right? If you've created a distraction like that. So, do you think that the sort of the pandemic and the work from home sort of expansion has actually made this problem more urgent to solve?
So I think that many of the routing issues are the same that they've always been. I think what the difference of the pandemic is what we've seen is the internet has become critical, right? It's in a way, not that it wasn't critical before, but it's just driven home to us because it's the only way we can work. It's the only way we communicate. And it is the sort of one single lifeline in a way that I think even if it was happening before, it wasn't quite so stark. I think as we all sort of do things from our own homes, the ability to have that tie out is a lifeline. So when that goes down, which is the potential concern about BGP, it's the significance of it is more extreme. So it's not that the problems haven't existed, that they haven't changed during the pandemic, but I think it's really emphasized how important fixing the challenge is, or if trying to address the problem is, because the consequences are just more stark and more obvious potentially.
Yeah, I think I talk a lot about our growing, the growth of digital dependence, right? And so that things that were minorly annoying 20 years ago now are, potentially life-threatening or certainly, organizationally catastrophic. One of the standing jokes that I have is that when I first joined the federal government in 1995, if the network went down, we just did something else for the day, right? Now, as you were saying, like it's critical to, organizations functioning, and it doesn't function. And, most organizations would have trouble functioning without the internet now. And it just creates a level of dependence that means that we really have to now address some of these fundamental weaknesses, that are baked into the internet. And of course, those are hard problems. But some of what I also wanted to talk about today is, the solution set and sort of what some of the potential solutions are and, what some of the barriers are to like why this problem exists. Why hasn't it been fixed? So let's talk a little bit about, some of the solution set and what some of the barriers are.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's remarkable about this problem is how long it's been around. It really has been around since the beginning or relatively early on. You look 20 years ago and there were BGP hijacks, which is what those are called. This isn't something that's new from that perspective. So the fact that it hasn't been fixed is sort of one of the more remarkable pieces given how potentially insecure it is. I think on the fixes piece, one thing that we have done there's been a lot of work on in the last few years is working on a cryptographic certification that someone is allowed to actually announce an IP address. So there's something called RPKI, which is essentially a cryptographic communication, or it's the cryptographically signed communication that says, yes, this entity is actually allowed to announce these IPs. And so what that enables people to do is potentially to identify when they should send content to another what's considered an autonomous system. They can send that. They can determine whether it's actually appropriate for that AS or ASN to actually announce those IP addresses. And so, if you're a large provider, what you can potentially do is you can sign your RPKA. You can basically create information about how someone announces. And then someone on the other end can filter. So they can actually send a communication, say, should I accept them from this entity or not, and then determine where to send traffic. So there's this whole new method of potentially saying, okay, this is where I should send traffic. And it is essentially a more trusted communication saying that, yes, this is what you can send traffic to. It doesn't solve all of the challenges of the PGP, but it is a significant improvement.
Yeah, so I think that obviously is a major, would be a major step forward, right? So both being able to, have the route origin authentication and the route origin validation, right? And it really takes both parties doing that. Both, you have to both produce the certificates, right? And then you have to have somebody actually use the certificates, which introduces a classic network effect, right? Which is that the more people that are producing certificates, the more useful it is to actually go through the process of validating. The more people that are validating, the more useful it is to actually produce the authentication certificate. So this is clearly a place where you really have the chicken and egg problem, right? Of how do you actually get people to adopt this technology, which is, of course, not entirely simple to implement, and particularly in a large network. But there are some other barriers to adoption as well. And I know that you've explored some of those from Cloudflare's perspective, because you've been a big proponent of adopting this technology.
We have. And, one of the things that we often find in this space, well, there are a couple different big challenges with adoption that we can talk through. But, one of the realities of something that's as technically complicated as RPKI, and not necessarily from a network standpoint, but from an outside, from a policy perspective, is that it just doesn't get the attention that it would get in an organization. These are big, long-term problems, and so I think within an organization, you often don't see this priority focus on it in as significant a way. It's, again, your chicken and egg problem. It doesn't go up to the top of the priority list for a lot of organizations. So I think that's one of the challenges. It's really sort of bringing it more into a public policy sphere where we can say, hey, there's actually action we can take together, collective action that will make a lot of progress. Make sure you prioritize this to organizations. So that's one step. There are more sort of challenges on the implementation side that we hear that are we have some legal challenges. Thinking about what liability frameworks are for maintaining that set of certificates, for example. So the way RPKI has been designed, right, or the way it's currently structured, the regional internet registries actually hold the certificates. So they then have a question of liability of who is responsible for the potential effects if RPKI doesn't work, for example. So that has been raised as a challenge for a number of organizations. But I think the interesting thing about that set of challenges, they're all things that we can potentially work through on a policy level, and that's where things are unusual. These aren't people don't disagree on the technical solution as much as the impediments to adoption are either policy oriented or legal. And I think from my perspective as a policy person, as opposed to a technologist, that means that there are things that we can potentially work through.
Yes, and I think the other challenge when you think about it too, from an economic standpoint, right, that there are real costs to implementing it. Like, you've got to actually implement the technology. You've got to use engineers' time. You've got to take resources and defer other projects. And the return on the investment does not necessarily come back directly to you, right? It's a spread across the ecosystem as a whole. And so I think that's another reason why many companies, network operators, really struggle with the question of, implementation here. Now, we've clearly seen some progress, right? We've had some network operators in different parts of the world have different adoption rates. But certainly, this points to the fact that a lot of this is about policy and law and economic incentives as much as it is the technical challenges.
Yeah, I think that the other piece on that question of incentives is there's an externality piece to it, which is that, so if you make a BG, if you make a mistake in routing, who does it affect? Whose customers? What is the sort of long-term economic effect? Those incentives aren't entirely on the company that might be making the mistake. And that's a sort of externality challenge in the broader prioritization piece. I think the adoption component, just thinking about how some of these things go forward, one of the interesting pieces to me is what an outsized role some of the the tier one providers can play. So when we think about different networks out there, there are some that are really, really large and actually have an outsized influence because they are so large. And so one of the things that's actually useful to think about from a policy perspective is that there are larger networks that can play have an outsized influence in this area, not only because they are sort of leaders in the space and it might help bring other people along, but also because of actually the way network routing works. The more interconnected you are, the more you're announcing wrong routes. So, for example, so if you are filtering and you are not re-announcing a bunch of wrong routes, you're actually going to reduce the overall impact of BGP route leaks anyway. So thinking through this from a policy standpoint and understanding that there are a relatively small number of providers who can make an outsized influence, and then we can continue to build in improvements for other operators, I think is an important piece of it.
Yeah, and I think all of this just comes back around to how we make progress on some of these fundamental problems, right? That if we can get a significant number of those, large network providers to do this, then the fact that we don't have everybody, decreases, right, in importance. And the fact that we can't get everybody doesn't mean that getting, large chunks to adopt it wouldn't be beneficial for the internet as a whole, and it could help tamp down some of the problem. I think the other. The flip side is that as the internet gets flatter, right, as there are, more efforts to, sort of make more direct, connections, that means that, sort of the route origin becomes a larger percentage of the total route. Right. And so that, again, sort of increases the utility of having, the ability to do that validation. So definitely, all the trends are for, addressing this problem. I think it's important to note as we've been talking about this, right, RPKI and some of those associated technologies don't solve all of the BGP problem, right? Because there is still the potential for, manipulating the business rules and other things to route information in strange ways that might not make sense otherwise, right? So this is not adopting this technology or similar solutions would not solve all of the weaknesses in BGP, right?
That's right. In networking generally, we often think about it as two different sets of systems, right? So there's a are you who you say you are? And that's what this communication is. That's what RPKI does. It is, are you allowed to say what you're saying, which is, are you allowed to announce the IP address? There's a separate question of, okay, what happens next? Yes, you're allowed to do this. What path does something take? And that's not solved by RPKI, as you said. I think that's a longer term challenge in the BGP space. But again, some of this is addressing the problems that we can solve right now, and taking positive steps towards things that will certainly reduce the likelihood of error, which is a significant one right now. And again, recognizing that it doesn't solve everything, but it will actually have a big impact, and it enables us to potentially also do some more assessment about when are things intentional, when are they not. There are a lot of good things I think that come out of taking the first steps on RPKI.
Yeah, and if you start to clear away some of the underbrush, right, then it makes it a lot harder for the adversaries who are trying to do this with malicious intent to actually hide among the errors and among the noise, which that's only beneficial. And again, if we can build up the stability of the internet, overall, that's also beneficial to, again, as society becomes, increasingly dependent on it as a critical utility, then, we need to do everything we can to increase its stability, to increase its reliability.
I think that's exactly right. I think that, this goes back to the pandemic, your point about the pandemic. I think one of the things that we see is that we actually do need a system that we can rely on. And I think that because people don't understand how the internet is architected, they don't actually understand what's gone wrong in those cases. So they don't always know that something was an accident or why there might be an accident. And I think that has long-term implications, just again, for stability of internet usage, of trust in the internet, of the ability to continue to use the systems that we work on for critical infrastructure. So I think the more we start to solve those problems, the more we start to secure systems at the infrastructure level to make those problems harder, that we actually build trust in the overall system, which is a really important piece, and something I think that we all should be interested in and focused on.
Yeah, so I think, one of the reasons I wanted to have this discussion is this is a topic that the Cyber Threat Alliance sees very much in our wheelhouse. This is about the security of the digital ecosystem, right? And we have a strong interest in promoting good policy. And I know this is an area that Cloudflare has worked a lot on. There will be, I know the Aspen Institute is planning to release a paper soon on, some ways that we can foster the development of the adoption of these kinds of technology. And I think that's something that, CTA will continue to promote. And I think that we will also continue to engage, here in the United States and around the world to promote, look at ways for governments to incentivize adoption. Are there policies that governments could adopt that would, reduce barriers or create, positive incentives to deal with some of those externalities that you mentioned. So, I do think that the good news is that there's finally starting to be some more awareness of this problem. Now what we're trying to do is figure out ways to talk about it in a way that clears away some of the technical complexity for, being able to make good policy.
I think that's exactly right. Some of the challenge here is making something that is now potentially a public policy problem accessible to people who can actually help solve that public policy problem. And so some of this is, if you can encourage companies to take action in this space, that improves the long-term security. But people have to understand what they're asking companies to do and what that looks like. And I think that the technical barrier to getting involved in that conversation has been high. So the fact that so many entities have gotten involved, or Aspen has gotten involved in making it more accessible for policymakers, I think is a huge step forward. And I think it's something, these are problems that we can help solve, which is also, I think, a really gratifying thing for someone who works in public policy and technology. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're about out of time here. So thank you, Alissa, for coming and chatting with me today on this topic. Again, this is one of those issues that is sometimes invisible, but is actually really, really important. So I appreciate you taking the time and enjoyed talking with you.
Well, thank you for having me, Michael. I agree. This is a great topic, and I'm so glad that you are tackling it. So I really appreciate being here today.
All right. Thanks. And we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Michael.